So our speaker today is Dr. Matthew Taylor, Professor Matthew Taylor, and he has, with his expertise on Islam-Christian relations, he has some news about a new institute that's starting that he's working on, and I want to just bring him up and let him share a little bit about that. And then he's going to give us a talk on crucial context for understanding contemporary Islam. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. So it's, as Paul was alluding to, I actually just got a job. So I've been adjunct faculty for the last year or so at Georgetown and at George Washington University, and this summer we'll be moving to Baltimore. So there's an Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Towson, which is just north of Baltimore, and it's an independent institute run by scholars, and I'll be one of 4 scholars working there. So I'll be in the Protestant scholar role. We also have a Catholic scholar, a Muslim scholar, and a Jewish scholar working on interfaith dialogue and interfaith relations, especially in the Baltimore area. So very exciting to have landed a job, and it's a really good one too. So I want to just review briefly. I was here about a month ago starting this 3-part series, and we'll conclude this 3-part series next week. So there was an awkward gap, so I just wanted to remind you of where we were a month ago. So I started just by making the point that demographically things are changing rapidly in the world and with regards to religion, especially with regards to Christianity and Islam. And by the end of this century, by the end of the 21st century, the Pew and a number of other groups have projected that with the current rate of population change, the world by the end of the century will be roughly 1/3 Christian, 1/3 Muslim, and 1/3 other. So the demographics are shifting, and right now, Christianity is the largest religion in the world by population. Islam's the 2nd largest. By the end of this century, those will have switched, and Islam will be the largest religion in the world. And so I think it is incredibly important that we try to understand Islam, that we try to understand Muslims, try to understand where they're coming from, and that we do it in a Christian way, as Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount, that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us, and we try to understand others as we would try to have them understand us, meaning graciously, kindly, thoughtfully, generously, assuming the best that we can of others. And I find that in interacting with a lot of Christians, especially a lot of American Christians, we don't tend to give Muslims the benefit of the doubt. We don't tend to try to see the best in them. We try often to find the worst. So I also talked a month ago about Islam actually emerges out of the same world of discourse, the same world of monotheistic discourse in the late antique Mediterranean world as Christianity and Judaism. It is in many ways the youngest sibling in the family of Abraham. And it very much emerges in conversation with these prior traditions, with these existent traditions, with communities of Jews and Christians in the Arabian area initially, and then after the early Arab conquests, with all kinds of Jews and Christians who are living under Muslim rule and living under Arab rule. And the Quran itself addresses us directly. It speaks to us as Christians. It calls us the people of the book, and it calls us back to its form of Abrahamic monotheism, its vision of renewed Abrahamic monotheism under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. So I think it's incumbent upon us as people who are addressed by the Quran, as people who are addressed by the Islamic tradition, to try to understand this tradition, to try to engage with it as something that has spoken to us as well. So let me talk a little about where we're going today. I am currently teaching an Introduction to Islam class at Georgetown, and we're just finally getting into the modern period. We have a few weeks to cover the modern period. So I'm trying in this lecture to condense about 6 weeks worth of material into about 40 minutes. So hold on, we're going to go fast a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about how did Islam come to be the 2nd largest and this remarkably diverse religion in the world. How did you move from 7th century Arabia and the Quran to the present diversity and spread of Islam? I want to talk a little bit about how did interactions between Christians and Muslims play out over all of those centuries, and where did we get some of our impressions of Islam, and then what do we need to know to be able to contextualize and understand the many manifestations of Islam today. So I want to start off by just talking about a few of the great debates in early Islam and in medieval Islam that shaped this tradition, and then I want to talk about this transition into modernity and the complexity that that brought to this tradition as well. So the biggest early debate in the Islamic community was over authority. Who would lead this community? And so the early community, as far as we can tell, is entirely united under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. If the Prophet Muhammad had had a son, things probably would have played out very, very differently over the centuries. But the Prophet Muhammad did not have a son. He had a number of daughters. He had one infant son that died as an infant and didn't survive into adulthood. And so after the death of the Prophet, suddenly there's this leadership gap. There's this question. And seemingly, the Prophet also did not designate a successor. There are many people who claimed that he had designated a successor later, but as far as we can tell historically, there was no designated successor. And so you have this question, upon the death of the Prophet in the year 632, who will lead this community? Who will take over guiding this community? And there really two camps emerge fairly quickly. Actually, three camps sort of emerge, but really two major camps emerge in that debate. One camp says, we should be Presbyterians. Let's get a council of elders together. Let's get a committee together of qualified people, and they will pick the best man, right? No real consideration of a woman at this point. They'll pick the best man. It'll be kind of a democratic process. It'll be a representative democracy. The elders of the community will elect the right person. And these people ultimately call themselves the Sunnis. Right? And Sunni comes from Sunnah, the path of the Prophet. They're like, this is what the Prophet would have wanted. The Prophet would have wanted the best qualified person to lead the community. Okay, so that's the Presbyterian, representative, democratic side of the debate. The other side of that debate says, actually, the Prophet's charisma, the Prophet's ethos is carried in the family of the Prophet. And the family of the Prophet should be the ones who continue to lead this community because they're connected, they're related to the Prophet. They should be the ones who guide this community. And they ultimately take the name Shiat Ali, because Ali is the son-in-law and the cousin of the Prophet, and he's seen as the first representative of the family who can take over the leadership of this community. And this becomes the Shia community today. Okay, so this is emerging as this early debate. Who should be the leaders of this community? The Sunnis are arguing for this kind of democratic sort of process where the most righteous person, the most righteous man gets elected by a council, and the Shia say it's in the family of the Prophet. And really, from fairly early on, the Sunnis are the majority. And they seem to kind of have held that majority, and this carries through to today. So today, about 80 to 85% of Muslims are Sunni. The Shia are a fairly small community within the Muslim population overall, about 10-15% of the Muslim population. And so the Shia have this experience of kind of breaking away, or at least they have a different vision of authority, even if sometimes they're in the same community. And they label the leaders of their community the imams. So first you have Ali as the first imam, as the son-in-law of the Prophet, and then his sons, Hassan and Hussein, become the imams, and it goes down the line. Now, within the Shiite community, the question of authority is not resolved. Because if the charismatic authority of the Prophet, and the Shiites argue that the imams are infallible. They make no mistakes. They carry on with that kind of preeminent authority of the Prophet, and so they will not make any mistakes. So then the question becomes, how many imams are there? How long does this infallibility carry on? And so there's a group that says 5. There were 5 imams, and they today are called the Zaydis. Zaydi, or the 5, some people just call them the Fiver Shias. These are the largest group in Yemen today, tend to be the Fiver Shiites. Another group says there were 7 in the line of succession. So there's sometimes called the Sevener Shiites, or the Ismailis. There were 7 immaculate imams that carried on this authority, and then the line ended after them. The majority of Shiites, though, ultimately say that there are 12 imams. There are 12 of these charismatic leaders, these charismatic guides to the community, and these are sometimes called the 12er Shiites. Sometimes people will just say, oh, those are the Shiites. That's the majority of the community. There's a break-off movement from this group called the Alawites, and this is the family, the Assad family that leads Syria today is Alawites. So they're within this kind of 12er tradition, but the majority of the 12ers live in Iraq and Iran, the community is really centered in Iran today, and that's the majority of the Shiite community. Now, this is kind of the big debate in early Islam. Who carries the authority? And this leads to a number of different civil wars. It's not as simple though as these communities just separate. Ali is still a very respected person within the Sunni community, and he actually becomes the 4th caliph. So the Sunnis elect 3 different caliphs, and finally they're like, okay, we can get around to Ali. He's a good guy. We'll make him the leader of the community, right? So they're still very much intermeshed in the early period, and then a challenger arises against Ali, this guy named Muawiyah. And Muawiyah says, no, we Sunnis are right, and Ali has made some mistakes. We disagree with him, and so this civil war erupts between the early proto-Sunnis and these early proto-Shiites, and they come to the battlefield, and neither of them really want to fight. They don't really want to be killing their fellow Muslims, and so they're like, let's just negotiate. Muawiyah thinks that he is the rightful leader of the community. Ali thinks he's the rightful community leader. They both think that they've been designated by God. They're like, let's negotiate this. And so they have a couple of skirmishes and a few people die, but they really are just sitting on this field of battle for about 100 days negotiating. And this other group of Muslims says, hold on a minute. You both think that God has made you the caliph. God has made you the leader of the community. If you really think that God made you that, we should fight. Right? If you really think that God has anointed you, let's let God sort it out. And whoever gets killed wasn't made caliph. And this becomes this fight. And that group of people is ultimately called the Kharijites, which literally means those who go out. Because they ultimately say, to hell with both of you, we don't think either of you are designated by God if you aren't willing to die for it. And so they break off. And today, this group of people is called the Ibadis, and they are the majority population of Oman in the Persian Gulf. So these are really the 3 strands of early Islam that survive until today. And this debate is still very much ongoing. And you'll find, even today, between Sunnis and Shiites, these grievances, the sense of grievance, especially from the Shiites, for the attacks that the majority Sunnis made upon the early Shiites, especially the martyrdom of the grandson of the Prophet Hussein, Ali's son Hussein, gets killed by Muawiyah. And this is seen as this incredible grievance that they would kill the grandson of the prophet over this political dispute. So this is one of the many great debates of early Islam. Another debate surrounds the Hadith. The Hadith sometimes are called collectively the Sunnah. All right, so Sunnis get their name from this term Sunnah, the path of the Prophet, and the Hadith are the actions and deeds and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad as remembered by his community. So the Hadith, they feel if you read them, and you can read them, they're in translation, they're online, they feel kind of similar in many ways to some of the gospel episodes. Somebody comes to the prophet with a question, or there's some encounter the prophet has with some individual or some group of people. There's an interaction, and then there's some kind of wise saying that is kind of concludes the episode. So the Sunnah is kind of these memories of the early community that then becomes an authoritative source of doctrine and guidance for the community. Because if the prophet is infallible, if the prophet is somebody who guides the community perfectly, if he is the model Muslim, then if we can just get back on his path, if we can just follow his example, then we will be on the right path as Muslims. And so you have this oral body of literature. It starts out as an oral body of literature, people reporting kind of memories similar to what we have in the Gospels, right? It starts out with people kind of reciting their memories of Jesus, and then at some point it ultimately gets written down. But for the Hadith, it takes several centuries before they actually get written down. And so you have these different chains of transmission of somebody saying, I remember that the prophet said this. And somebody else says, I remember he said that, but he said it slightly differently. And so it starts these different chains of transmission. Well, which one of these which one of them was a better rememberer, right? And so people start thinking through, okay, well, what was the right memory of the prophet? What was the right memory of that saying? Now the Shiites, despite not claiming to be the Sunnis, they aren't naming themselves after the path of the Prophet. They like the Hadith a lot as well, but they add in Hadiths from the Imams, because the Imams are also infallible, and so they have this kind of added body of literature, of memories of these Imams, these descendants of the Prophet who are also infallible, who also can give guidance to the community. So by the time, this process begins in the 7th century, goes through the 8th and the 9th century. By the time you get to the 10th century, the 900s, people start saying, we really should write these down. We really should get these into collections, organize them in such a way, because it's all been this oral chains of transmission. Let's write these down. The problem is there are hundreds of thousands of hadith. And everyone acknowledges that some of these are made up. Some of these are fabricated. Not necessarily fabricated out of any malicious intent, but people say, I really have this pleasant sentiment, let me put it in the words of the prophet, put it in the mouth of the prophet, because that'll lend it a little bit more credence and authority. Right? So everyone knows some of these things are made up, but then how do you get to the right ones? How do you figure out which ones are the good hadith and which ones are the bad hadith? And what it creates, as they start to write them down and sift through them, is a tiered body of scriptural literature, which is a unique phenomenon in the world of Scripture, in the world of religious Scripture. It's graded. There are different tiers of hadith in terms of which ones are most authoritative and which ones are not authoritative. So the most authoritative ones are called sahih, clear. The clear ones, the ones that you have kind of universal attestation, you can trace it in multiple lines back to the Prophet, and very clearly aligned with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And so virtually all Muslims would agree with the Sahih classification. With this group of hadith, those ones are totally right. And there's two scholars in the 10th century that write collections of these Sahih. And they're called, the collections are called Sahih Muslim, because the author's name is Muslim. It's not his title. His name is Muslim. And so Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari are kind of the two collections that are kind of universally recognized by everyone. Those are the really authoritative ones. Now there's a bunch of other ones that everyone's like, we really like these ones, but we can't say that they're absolutely certain. So they have this kind of sub-level. They're called Hasan, or good, and they're generally accepted, but not necessarily quite as authoritative. So it might be something that you quote the Prophet as saying, but in terms of actually making theology or making law, you're not going to necessarily use one of those for that. Right? So they're good, they're useful, they might teach you something about piety or about how to live, but we're not going to put them on the same level as the Sahih. And then you have some that are rated weak, right? Okay, they're maybe the Prophet said it, maybe not. We'll stick it in some collection somewhere. If you want to quote it, if you want to put it on your Facebook page, that's fine. But just we're not going to use this as an authoritative resource. Right? So you'll sometimes hear, if you're ever engaged in kind of intra-Muslim debate or paying attention to it, they'll say, oh, that's a weak hadith. Right? That's not authoritative. That's a lower grade than the ones that we trust. And then you have, on the outside of all of this, all the ones that are fabricated. All the ones that everyone agrees, those are not valid. So what this winds up with is a set of 6 different collections, of 4 that are Hasan, or that contain some Sahih, and then 2 Muslim and al-Bukhari that are totally kind of authenticated, that are the Sahih ones. And all told, within those 6 collections, you have about 20,000 of these accounts. 20,000 different stories and sayings of the Prophet that become kind of the guidance for the Muslim tradition. So one of the early Hadith scholars says, the Hadith came to rule over the Quran, not the Quran over the Hadith. Not saying that they have more authority than the Quran, right? The Quran is the central scripture. But the Hadith surround the Quran. They give context to the Quran. The Quran is a lyrical text. It's a prophetic text, and it gives you a sense of guidance, but it doesn't give you much interpretation. Right? So the Hadith give context to the Quran and become the matrix through which almost all Muslims will interpret and think about the Quran. Now, another crucial medieval debate that arises, in part out of the Hadith, is the question of jurisprudence, what you might have heard of as Sharia. Right? Sharia just means law. Right? It just means the divine law, the law of God. So within the Islamic tradition, theology is a pretty simple debate. We Christians made theology really complicated. We decided that we were going to believe in a God who was simultaneously 3 in 1. That's really hard. And so we spent centuries debating how do you have a God who's 3 and 1, and we ultimately came up with formulations like the Nicene Creed, right? Or we decided we're also going to believe in a human being who's also God, but is still fully a human being and is fully God. That's really complicated. And so that leads to a lot of debates within the Christian tradition. So all of our Christian debates are about theology. Within Islamic theology, though, it's fairly simple. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Right? Compare that's the shahada, that's the statement of faith that Muslims will say. That if you say that and mean it, then you're a Muslim. Right? And so compare that to the Nicene Creed. Right? Begotten before all worlds, very God of very God, light of light. Right? No. There's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Now there are debates in Islamic theology, but they just aren't that complicated. And they're usually debates more about the Quran and what the status and the ontological status of the Quran is. So for most Muslims, though, the more pertinent debate is, that's orthodoxy, right? What do you believe? What's the right belief? For most Muslims throughout history, the more pertinent debate is, well, how do you live it out? What do you do once you believe? If you can say, there's no God but God, God is the only God, and Muhammad's the messenger of God, well, what do you do now? And that's orthopraxy, the right practice. What is the right way to live as a Muslim, right? Similarly, within Judaism, the theological debates are fairly simple, and then the focus shifts to ethics and life and morality. What do you do with life? How do you live as a religious person? So this becomes then the driving question of Islamic jurisprudence. What does it mean to live as a good Muslim? What does it mean to live in this world, to follow the path of the Prophet, to live in this world and live out this very simple creed? And this is where you get this term Sharia. Sharia just means the divine opinion from all eternity, God's perspective on anything. And if God is all-knowing and there's only God, then God has an opinion about everything. God has an opinion about how you clean your teeth. God has an opinion about whether you should drink coffee or not. Is coffee an intoxicant? Coffee doesn't get introduced to the Muslim world until the 15th century. And suddenly there's a huge jurisprudential debate. Can we drink this? So we're not supposed to drink wine, because that's an intoxicant. Is coffee an intoxicant? Right? Huge debate. Right? Because God must have an opinion. Now the challenge, though, is always, yes, God has God's opinion from all eternity, but what can we know about that? There are epistemological limitations, to use a fancy phrase. There are limits as human beings to what we can know of God's total knowledge, of God's total will. And so this becomes then the endeavor of what Muslims will call jurisprudence, fiqh. Right? So Sharia is the ideal. It's what God wants and knows from all eternity. But what we live with here in the human realm is jurisprudence. We live with what we can process and figure out of what God wants. Right? And so I like to think of this as a sort of input-output machine. Okay? So this is the process of Islamic jurisprudence, the process by which Muslims try to figure this out. So you have a new question, something that hasn't come up before, and you're going to try to figure out God's opinion. Coffee. Is coffee okay? Well, that's the input. Is coffee acceptable? Is coffee halal, as Muslims would put it? Is it something that we can drink, and would God approve of that? Right? We don't know. God never said anything about coffee. Well, let's try to figure it out. So you have some different sources that you can use. And so you'll bring your question to a scholar, trained scholar who knows the Quran, a scholar who knows the Hadith, a scholar who knows what the past precedents, right? It's a legal conversation. What's the precedent? What have been the past rulings that other judges or other scholars have made? What about the consensus of the communities? Right? And one of the hadith that is very prominent within the Islamic tradition is the Prophet saying, "My community will not agree upon a lie." In other words, the Islamic community as a whole cannot go wrong. Right? So if the Islamic community as a whole decides we're drinking coffee, well, the Prophet's community has come to a consensus. But this, by the way, is how Muslims ultimately overrule the practice of slavery. Because like the Bible, there's nothing in the Quran that says slavery is wrong. It just kind of assumes the existence of slavery, just like the Bible assumes the existence of slavery. But within the Islamic tradition, ultimately, Muslims said the entire community has agreed that slavery is wrong. It's wrong. That's the consensus of the community. Right? So the consensus has a real power. It has a formal role. And then you just have the scholar's own idiosyncratic mind. How are they reasoning and thinking through all of this? How are they putting together all the pieces of these 20,000 different hadith? Which ones are they selecting as an analogy to coffee? Is the analogy to wine, or is the analogy to dates? right? Those are very different analogies that you would draw, but they're both within this realm of jurisprudence. And so what comes out of this process is what is called a fatwa. A fatwa is just a non-binding opinion of a scholar, right? So you bring your question, can I drink coffee, to a scholar. The scholar does all the processing, compares the Quranic verses, picks out which hadith are the right ones, looks at the consensus of the community, and then they tell you, here's my opinion. And that's a fatwa. Sometimes we hear about fatwas, and the American press is terrible about this terminology, and they'll act like this is the Islamic ruling. This is what Sharia law tells you to do. No, it's one scholar's opinion. And if you don't like that fatwa, go find another scholar. They'll probably give you a different one. Right? So this leads to an intrinsic pluralization within the realm of Islamic jurisprudence. Right? Because different scholars are going to put this process together differently. So when people talk about Sharia, well, Sharia is never codified law. It's always this constant discourse and debate among scholars about these different views, about different ways of putting the pieces together to come up with the right way to live as a Muslim. And so within this kind of these different branches, you have different kind of organized ways of thinking about jurisprudence. And so especially within the Sunni tradition, the classical Sunni tradition, you have these 4 different schools of law, as they put it. 4 different schools of jurisprudence that have their own methods, their own ways of calibrating, of putting together the Quran and the analogies and these different things. So the scholars kind of organize themselves into these different schools, and all the schools basically recognize each other as valid. So you could be a Hanbali scholar and be talking to a Maliki scholar and have very different conclusions about any given question, but you're like, yeah, you're doing it fine, right? Because there's another hadith of the Prophet that says the scholar that does the processing right and comes to the right conclusion gets 2 rewards. But the scholar who does the processing wrong and comes to the wrong conclusion gets 1 reward. Right? So there's something valid about the process of doing the work. And in neither case, if you come to the wrong conclusion, you still get a reward because you were working hard and trying to figure it out. Right? So there's this acknowledgement within the Islamic tradition, especially within the Sunni Islamic tradition, we're always kind of guessing. And you'll find Muslims will say, but Allah knows best. It's a common phrase for Muslims. It's actually Quranic. Allah knows best. Right? We have our debates, we have our things, but Allah knows best. Right? So sometimes when you hear, and again, demographers are really bad with this as well. They'll go and do a survey and they'll say, is there one right way of understanding Islam? And 80% of Muslims in the Muslim world will say, yes, there's one right way. And other people will see fundamentalism. Right? They think there's only one right way of understanding Islam. I think what most people are saying in that is, yeah, God knows the right way. We're all guessing. We're all trying to figure this out. But God knows the right way and there's one right way. We might be tangentially and asymptotically approaching that one way in all of our endeavors. We never fully know it because we live in the world of jurisprudence. So the other element that enters into all of this is the world of Sufi mysticism. You can almost not overstate the influence of Sufism on Islam. Sufis are, it starts as this kind of mystical, ascetic group of people who go out and really kind of deprive their bodies for the sake of their souls and try to replicate the experience of the Prophet receiving revelation directly from God and go out into the desert and try to pray, devote themselves to prayer, to remembrance of God, performing certain kind of remembrance rituals in order to know and kind of purify their souls so that they can be close to God. This becomes integrated into the Muslim world. And so Sufism is not a separate sect of Islam. Sufism kind of inhabits all of these. It's a spirituality that connects all of these different things. So you can belong to any one of the schools of law and be a Sufi. You can be a Shiite or a Sunni and be a Sufi. Right? And it becomes the spirituality of Islam that is connected in many ways to all these different things. And many of the scholars who are doing all this complicated jurisprudence stuff are also Sufis. They also have this spirituality of Sufism. So when we come to the cusp of modernity, as I put it, as we come to the beginnings of the modern world, what is the status of Islam in this world, in maybe the 15th or 16th century? Well, it's a diverse world of discourse among philosophers and jurists and hadith and Quran scholars and Sufi saints and poets. Right? You have all these different fields of knowledge, all these different fields of discourse, all these different sciences, as Muslims will put it, of ways of thinking about Islam, ways of approaching Islam. It's also a very pluralized and localized world. Because in any given region, one school of law might be dominant, but the other schools of law might be present there as well. And you can find scholars with differing opinions within all those places. So there's a general mode of toleration within late medieval, early modern Islamic culture. Because they're recognizing, well, we have all these different interpretations, but we can accept that, right? So there's Sufi brotherhoods, these kind of organized groups of Sufis. There's these different schools of jurisprudence. There's the Sunnis and the Shiites, who, for most of Islamic history, have coexisted side by side just fine, with the Shiites usually being in the minority. And then you have Christian and Jewish minorities, what are called in the Quran dhimmis, protected people. As long as they pay their taxes, they're fine. We don't try to convert them. They're fine. They're protected. They have this dhimmi status. And so you have minorities of Jews and Christians also living within this world. And you have a more or less stable social order. By the late medieval period, the caliphs, the ostensible spiritual, political leaders of the community, largely become figureheads. And so there would be an emperor or a sultan who would be in charge, and they'd say, oh yeah, I have the caliph over here, and they have some kind of religious duties, but they're symbolic leaders of the community. You have magistrates, and you have scholars, and they're all kind of living within this fairly stable social order. Now, we come to modernity. And what is modernity? I doubt that you spent any great amount of time thinking about this, and it's a very complicated question when you try to think about what is modernity? What does it mean to be modern? If you go back and read the ancient Greeks, they would talk about we modern people, because everyone has always thought of themselves as modern. Modern usually just means it's a synonym of contemporary, right, or of current, right? So we, in the modern world, have tended to think about modernity as something special. And there are some things that have made the modern world as we experience it special. And let me offer three as a non-exhaustive list, and then talk about how this has all come into interaction with Islam. One thing that has characterized our modern world, really the world of the last 4 or 5 centuries, is an accelerating mode of knowledge. Knowledge moves faster. We have academic disciplines; those existed in the medieval world, but suddenly they're accelerating, they're congealing, and they're producing knowledge at an accelerated rate. We have scientific discoveries. We have geographical discoveries. The New World, right, spurs on this movement towards modernity when Columbus and these other explorers begin to discover, oh, hey, there's a whole other world out there that we could explore and exploit, right? And these new technologies that emerge from that as well. Right? That's one of the elements of modernity. Another element of modernity is what I call universalizing narratives. Right? We have narratives that suddenly we're talking about humanity as opposed to us. Right? Suddenly it's about humanity as opposed to Britain. It's humanity, or it's human beings. Right? We have ideologies like democracy. We Westerners tend to think democracy is the best form of government, and everyone should live in a democracy. That's a very universalizing sentiment. Why should everyone live in a democracy? Well, because it's the right way to do things. It's the universal, right? We tend to think in these big categories of ideologies, socialism, right? Nazism, these huge universal categories. That's a strange feature of our modern world. Or even the idea of human rights. Everyone has human rights. Well, tell that to someone in the 16th century. They would not have understood what you were talking about, right? Because they weren't thinking in these huge universalizing narratives. The last thing that I would point, or the third thing at least, is that we have these globalizing connections, right? Suddenly you have the world becoming more and more interconnected, more and more overlaid with all these layers of technology, communications technology, all these layers of intersecting cultures and cross-cultural pollination. You know, ideas that don't observe the borders that we draw on maps, right? Ideas begin to move across those borders and connect these different cultures. And then you have transnational economic interests, right? Multinational corporations that are not bound within a nation state, but are trying to make a profit no matter where they can, and often exploit no matter who they can to make that profit. So this is the modern world as we experience it. And it's a very complicated place. It's not something that any of us have really figured out. The Muslim world experienced it in a very negative way initially. The crucial context for understanding how the Muslim world experienced this modernity, or at least Western modernity as we understand it, was colonialism. So the European technological and military superiority after the discovery of the New World and this competition, this race to exploit the New World, to grab hold of all the resources of the New World, leads to this flourishing of European empires around the world. And some estimates would say that about 90% of the Muslim population was colonized by Europe. Think about that. 90% of the world's Muslim population is colonized by Europe in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. So there's this experience of European global dominance, European global hegemony that comes in and becomes the kind of dominant way that Muslims experience modernity. Modernity for most of the Muslim world, and really for most of the world, comes crashing down on them like a ton of bricks. You have armies of European soldiers, accompanied by armies of European administrators, accompanied by armies of European missionaries, that all show up on their shores and say, we're now in control. And we're going to show you what it means to be modern. We're going to show you our enlightened way of being. So this becomes this dominant experience for Muslims. We Christians tend to think about the Crusades as this kind of paradigmatic moment between Christianity and Islam where you had civilization versus civilization. In the Muslim world, the Crusades were seen as this bizarre episode that ended quickly. They didn't even coin a term for the Crusaders. They just called them the Franks, the Farange. Like, yeah, these dirty French people came in and took over Jerusalem for about 70 years. They really thought they were pretty dirty. They probably were. These dirty French people took over Jerusalem for about a century, and then we got rid of them. The Franks. The word crusader in Arabic gets coined in the colonial period, when Muslims realize how important the Crusades were, and they use it as an analogy for their own time. And when Osama bin Laden writes his treatises against the West, he doesn't call them Westerners. He calls them Salafiya, Crusaders. So this becomes then the dominant way that Muslims experience. But again, there's not a monolithic response to this experience of colonialism. So you have some Islamic modernists who say, we can do this. We can grab hold of all this technology, of all this Western philosophy, and we can modernize the Muslim world. Right? And they're intellectuals, they're reading all these Western philosophers, they're reading all these Enlightenment thinkers, and they're trying to integrate that knowledge and even co-opt that knowledge and say, actually, this knowledge is Islamic knowledge. The West didn't know about Aristotle. They weren't reading Aristotle because they didn't have Aristotle until that knowledge was translated back into the European world through the Islamic world. So really, all of this modernity, it's coming from us. Right? They're laying claim to modernity from within an Islamic framework. You have a group, or a number of different thinkers, a number of different political organizers who argue this is a moment where we need to organize as an intranational or an international coalition of Arabs or of Bengalis or of South Asians. And so you start to have different movements of nationalism saying, no, we need to claim these imposed ethnic and national categories that are coming to us from our colonial occupiers. We need to use those to move forward our own projects, to move forward our own identities. And then you have this reaction that ultimately gets labeled Islamism that says all of this, all these problems that have encountered, all this weakness that we've experienced through this colonial encounter comes because we weren't really following the path of the Prophet. We weren't living according to Islamic law. We weren't living this righteous life. We need to remake society using an Islamic template. One of the big movements of this is the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1922. And the Muslim Brotherhood slogan is, the Quran is our constitution. And everyone says, what do you mean? And they're like, the Quran is our constitution. So they aren't giving a whole lot of definition, but they have this kind of idealized political vision. If we could just get back to the Quran, if we could just get back to Islam, then we would be good. Well, part of the fallout of this colonial encounter is that you start to have the creation of nation states. And during and after European colonialism, the Muslim world begins to form these different nation states, or have these forms imposed upon them by these different Western colonial powers. Because over time, especially after the World Wars, or in the middle of the World Wars, Europe starts to realize it's really expensive to maintain a colonial empire. It's really expensive, and we're fighting all these wars at home. We need to rebuild Europe. This is really complicated. Let's just make them nation states. Let's just use this model that we have from the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century. We'll introduce them to the international order, and we'll draw some boundaries and give them nation state status. But these national borders and the politics that shape them are usually more about the concerns of Europe than they are about the concerns of the people on the ground. The classic example of this is during the middle of World War I, towards the end, you had a French diplomat named Picot and a British diplomat named Sykes get together, and they held a number of secret meetings, and they say, after this World War ends, and the Ottomans are one of our enemies, right? The Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, one of the last remaining Muslim empires at the time, had entered on the side of the Axis powers. The Ottomans, once this is over, we're going to have to divvy up the Ottoman Empire. We're going to have to figure out how to do it. Let's draw the maps now. And they had the Russians as kind of a silent party to it. The Russians said, as long as you give us Istanbul, we're fine. And so they start drawing lines on maps and saying, here's what we're going to do once this war is over, once we've defeated the Ottomans, here's how we're going to divide it. So they divide up, and you can see by the colors of the map. The area in the blue, the dark blue, will be total control by the French, and then the light blue will be the area of influence that the French will hold after World War I. And then the area in the light yellow will be British influence, and the area in the dark yellow will be total control by the British. The Russians get kind of up by the Caspian Sea. The Italians can have part of Turkey. It'll be fine. So they start drawing these lines on the map. They're drawing these lines in Europe. They're not thinking about the populations that are there. They're just like, no, this is where we go. And so this Sykes-Picot line is still the line. Right? This is the line that divides Jordan from Syria and Iraq from Syria. Right? That's the line. That's the Sykes-Picot line. And if you notice, the modern state of Iraq largely follows that British-French lines of influence, those British-French regions. They all recognized that Palestine was going to be the most complicated one. They're like, let's call it international, and that way we don't have to worry about it. Right? We don't know what to do with Palestine. We'll just keep it kind of as this nebulous region. But those are the lines that get drawn. And part of what ISIS does when it arises, right, it declares itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or in Arabic, of Al-Shams, the Levant, of the region. Because they're like, we don't buy your lines. These lines that you drew 100 years ago in Europe, we don't accept them. We don't accept that is how the Middle East should be divided up. So this is then compounded by the Caliphate is officially in 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. He himself is a secularist, and he's really frustrated by all the outside political influences, and everyone's focused on the Caliph because the Caliph is in Istanbul, or the Sultan is there in Istanbul, and he says, we're done with it. It's over. It was always symbolic for the last 500 years anyway. It's over. But then this brings to the fore the question, well, what does authority mean? Is authority of Islam located at the nation-state level? Is there anyone who speaks for Islam as a whole? Is there any unifying figure or unifying leader who can guide the Islamic community as a whole? Last point. Last complex transition, the Hadith come up again in modernity. Because as you have this experience of colonialism, as you have this experience of colonial powers, you have a number of scholars, Western scholars, we call them Orientalists now, and missionaries who come into the Islamic world. They're reading the Hadith and like, we know how to understand this text. We have biblical critical methods. We have all these resources that we've developed for understanding and sifting out the parts of the Bible. Let's bring those to the Hadith. And most of what they conclude is, this is all hogwash. This is not historical material. It was passed down by all these chains of oral transmission. It's all about kind of intra-Muslim disputes of the 10th century. This is nothing in here is genuine or authentic. This is not historical material. Muslims should just let go of it. You're talking about people's scripture, right? And so suddenly you have, as these Western scholars are coming in and rereading and rethinking the Hadith, you have a variety of different Muslim responses to this. some Muslims, especially those kind of Islamic modernists, are like, yeah, the Hadith are really problematic. Let's just focus on the Quran. And this becomes this movement within Islam of Quran-only Muslims. They tend to be the kind of liberal, progressive reformers. The challenge is, the Quran is a very elusive text. And you can read into it whatever you want, in many ways. Right? If you want to find an impetus for war in the Quran, you can find that in there. If you want to find an outline for society that looks very modern, you can find that in there. And so some of the Quran-only type scholars also move towards more of an aggressive jihad posture because they're finding what they want in the Quran. Right? So Quran-only is one approach. Let's just abandon the Hadith. You have a movement that would call themselves traditional Muslims that are like, no, that system that we've always had works really well. We have scholars. We bring our questions to those scholars. We get answers from them. They teach us how to live our lives. Those answers are non-binding. This is, I think, what most Muslims, when you see surveys, Muslims who want Sharia law. In many ways, what they're saying is, we want traditional local justice. We want to be able to take our questions to scholars who understand us and have those scholars offer us their opinions, and then we can take that opinion to a judge, and maybe the judge agrees, maybe not. But it's kind of a local civil law that can govern our society, kind of idealizing this medieval model that worked fine. This is what traditional Muslims would say. And then you have this movement, and we'll talk more about them next week, called the Salafis. This is the movement that I study within Islam, that decide what we really need to do in this moment is go back and reinvigorate the study of the Hadith, and not only reinvigorate it, but have everyone study the Hadith. Not just the scholars anymore, because the Hadith had largely been the realm of the scholars. Everyone should study the Hadith. Everyone should be memorizing these stories. Everyone should be reading these medieval texts and thinking through them. And so the Salafis actually call themselves the Protestant reformers of Islam. They're doing away with all the clerical lines of authority that have insulated people from their scriptures. They're saying, we're going back to the scriptures. We're going back to the text. We are drawing people back into sola scriptura Islam. And this becomes problematic in all kinds of different ways, and we'll talk about that a little more next week. So, we come to contemporary Islam, the Islam of today. You have roughly 1.7 billion Muslims spread all over the globe, and they all have their own hyphenated identities. They are Moroccans, Sufis who follow the Hanbali madhab, who are gay. Right? That's a very complicated identity, just like our complicated identities. And all of those old identity categories are alive and well today. Sunni and Shiite, all the schools of jurisprudence, all these different modes of interpretation, the Sufis, they're all alive and well today. And have all intersected with modernity and are creating these hyphenated identities that we experience as well. Right? I'm an evangelical background, seminary-trained, mainline Protestant who is heterosexual and studied Islam at a Catholic university and is working as a scholar. And all of those are parts of who I am. And when I think about religion, all of those are parts of how I think about religion. Right? So that's all. Everyone in the Muslim world has those same complexities. Right? There's no such thing as a generic Muslim. And all of these old and new debates that animate the intra-Muslim disagreements are still alive and well today. So Islam is every bit as extroverted and complicated and variegated as Christianity. When I first started studying Islam, I thought Christianity is really complicated and Islam looks really simple. They have a really simple creed, they have a really simple belief system, they must all be unified. The reality is they're every bit as divided and complicated and internally disagreeing as we Christians are. Let me end by offering 3 lessons for us, and then I'll have a few time to take some questions. So my first lesson is that everyone comes from somewhere. We're all shaped by historical forces, by communal identities, by communal rivalries that we did not choose. You didn't ask to be born Protestant. You were probably raised with certain impressions of Catholicism that maybe you've had to overcome in the course of your life by having Catholic friends. You might have been shaped by certain impressions of Judaism or of Islam that you've had to work through over the course of your life. But when we come to Islam and we start saying, well, why can't they just be like us? Why can't they just see the world the way that we see the world? A, that's historically naive, and B, that is incredibly ungracious as Christians. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we would ask others to interact with us in all of our complexity, to interact with us in all of and understanding all the social and historical forces that have shaped us. So in the same way that there's no such thing as a generic Christian, there's no such thing as a generic Muslim. And they have also been shaped by historical forces. Some of those historical forces have been at the will of our ancestors, the will of the West that has shaped the Muslim world. My second lesson is modernity is really hard. It's really hard to be modern people. Living in the world that we live in. We live in this fast-paced and contradictory and culturally colliding and exploitative world that disorients every one of our identities, that disorients every one of our religious ideas, that it's dislocating to live in modernity. And no one's figured it out. There's no one who is perfectly attuned to modernity, and if they ever find themselves perfectly attuned, wait 5 minutes, because modernity is going to change. Right? A few years ago, we all thought Facebook was going to connect the world. And today we're having these debates about, should Facebook be regulated like a public utility, because it's so dangerous. Right? Modernity turns on a dime, because everything is changing, and knowledge just keeps moving forward. And so it's so easy for us to say, well, why can't Muslims modernize? A, what do we even mean by modernize? They live in modernity just like we do. They live in this world that has been shaped by modernity. B, have we modernized? Have we really caught up with the times? And if so, what have we cut off from our past to get there? My last point is this. We Westerners have contributed significantly to the chaos and the destabilization that bedevils the majority Muslim world today. Our ancestors did that. And when we sneer at them and when we blame Islam as some abstracted concept for the problems in the Middle East or the problems in the majority Muslim world or the problems in Pakistan, when we look at that and say, see, Islam's just unenlightened, that's adding insult to injury. We participate in that. I'm not saying that we in this room are the ones who are fully responsible for every problem in the world today. But I think we can at least look at our own history and say, our ancestors participated in creating a lot of these problems. And it's not Islam that created those problems. Islam interacts with all those problems. And in Islam, or Muslims, right, because there's no such thing as Islam, it's just Muslims. Muslims have responded to those things in helpful and unhelpful ways, but it's not Islam that made this. It's the modern world and all of its complexity and the history of exploitation that has participated in it as well. I'm going to end there. I covered 6 weeks in 50 minutes. So I'd love to have some time for questions and interaction and clarification. Yeah?
Good job.
Thank you.
This is incredibly difficult stuff. I tried it for years. But I think you're sliding Aristotle. And that's crucial to understand everything that's happening between 800 and 850, both in the Islamic world and in Europe. Like this. The Crusaders disrupt the situation. That is not totally negative. Because after Harun al-Rashid gets his great city of books, which is Baghdad, that's 800. The Islamic world has 150 years of very deep scholarship, and it's innovative, but these guys had no concept of modernity as such. And this is also true in Europe. What they want to do, they cannot conceive themselves as being better than the ancient world.
Right.
That's where they're trying to go. Aristotle is key for that.
I would agree. Yeah, Aristotle's huge for that. I mean, but especially within the realm of Islamic philosophy. I mean, a lot of the people working on the Hadith, don't care a whit about Aristotle. They're like, well, what's the model of prophet?
I think the Hadith comes later. Aristotle is who they're after in the great period of about 150 years, when the Arabs are very busy becoming modern without understanding what's going on. The papacy
that's where I would disagree.
people-
I think Islamic philosophy is one of these fields of knowledge. And those people are very engaged with Aristotle, they're very engaged with Greek philosophy. But you have these other streams of knowledge, they're called the ulum, right? The sciences of classical Islam. And that in many ways the philosophers are a part of this world, and they're using Aristotle, and they become incredibly influential, especially in the West, right? All the Westerners, they're all reading Al-Ghazali, they're all reading Avicenna.
But they get sick and tired of Aristotle because it gets them into kinds of complexities they're not yet ready. This also happens in Europe, by the way. Where did Oxford and Cambridge come from? It comes from how do we deal with Aristotle, which the Arabs have turned away from and put on the shelf because he's too dangerous.
I don't think the Arabs ever turned away from Aristotle.
They
were still reading.
1050. There's a closing of the gates of interpretation. They are no longer involved in great numbers and trying to go through the ancient texts and interpret them.
I think you're blending the world of jurisprudence with the world of philosophy in a way that I would. We can talk more, but I think the gates of interpretation are the gates of ijtihad. It's the world of jurisprudence. Philosophy is a related conversation, but it's not the same one. Yeah.
I just had a question about what you were calling the traditional
Yes.
Muslims. You said, I think, that their notion is that they submit their questions to a local authority, and that person, then they come away with the opinion, and then if they can submit that opinion then to another judge. Is that a civil judge? Is that a religious judge? How does that?
So in classical Islam, there's not really a distinction between civil and religious. So part of we in Christianity, because we have this very complicated conversation about theology, we think of that as kind of this separated discipline. And then in some strands of Christianity, they think about law, right? You have canon law in the Catholic tradition. We don't have really a legal discourse in the Christian tradition that is much to speak of. But within the Islamic tradition, ethics and law and philosophy, all these things kind of get melded together in this conversation about jurisprudence. Now the challenge is, there's all kinds of things in Islamic law that no one could enforce.
Right. So if I get an opinion from somebody, I have a dispute with Cyril.
Right.
I have to go ahead and get my opinion. Cyril gets his opinion.
So what most of Islamic cultures did in the classical period is there would be people appointed as qadis, as judges. And so you would go to your scholar, and Cyril would go to his scholar, and both of those scholars would issue a fatwa. And then they would bring that to the appointed judge, and the judge would say, I accept this one. Or the judge would say, I accept neither of these. Here's my ruling. Right? So, but in other words, they're almost like amicus briefs. Right? They're a way to get an official scholarly opinion. Again, and depending on what school of jurisprudence that scholar was following, it might be a very different one from the one that Cyril's doing. And then there's this almost independent system of justice, right, of criminal justice or legal civil justice that is kind of issuing these. But it's all very localized. It's all very focused on.
Where did the judge come from? Who chose the judge?
It was usually the political authorities who would choose the judge. Yeah.
Your last question.
Last question.
Okay.
Yeah.
For Muslim people that we come in contact with, are they always living under a sense of waiting for decisions, or living under this sense of jurisprudence all the time on different subjects?
No. For the most part, most questions are fairly standardized. Depending on which school of law you follow, there's probably a standard opinion, standard interpretation of this food's okay and this food's not, or this is a practice that you can accept. Most things in Islamic law, it's like, that's fine. Right? There's no opinion, or there's no. It's either good or not suggested. But there's no kind of prohibition
so in practical day-to-day life,
Right.
They're not like every decision I have to check and I have to live under this decision.
And also part of modernity is that whole conversation has also been globalized, and so you can go online. So there are websites of scholars that are issuing their fatwas. Again, they're offering their opinions. It's like a blog post, right? It's a well-informed blog post based on Islamic law. But you can go and ask your question. There's hotlines. you can dial a fatwa, right? Like, and get an opinion from a scholar on your particular question and on the nuances of your particular question. But most Muslims, it's fairly clear how they're supposed to live, and if they encounter a question, they're like, oh, this seems to add a different shade to this particular topic. I'm going to go ask a scholar about that. Yeah.
Okay, we better stop now.